In the winter of 1915, the war in Europe had already sunk into mud and misery. The Western Front was locked in stalemate, stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, a vast scar of trenches where men lived and died for inches of ground. In London, frustration gnawed at the politicians and generals who had promised quick victory. Among them was a restless mind who refused to accept deadlock. Winston Churchill, the young First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill believed the war could be won not by bleeding out in France, but by striking boldly at the enemy's weakest point. The Ottoman Empire, ancient and decaying, had joined Germany and Austria-Hungary only months before. Its armies guarded the narrow Dardanelles Strait, a ribbon of water linking the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. If that strait could be forced, the Allied fleets could reach Constantinople, topple the Sultan's government, and open a supply route to embattled Russia. "Knock out Turkey," Churchill declared, "and we knock open the back door of Europe." It was a daring idea, and disastrously seductive. The Dardanelles sounded like a shortcut to victory, a single stroke that could change the war's course. In early 1915, with France and Britain desperate for progress, the plan was approved. Naval intelligence promised weak coastal defenses. Admirals spoke confidently of battleships sweeping through the straits. Few asked what might happen if the ships failed, or if men had to land on those hostile shores. The campaign began with optimism. In February 1915, Allied warships gathered off the Gallipoli Peninsula, their gray hulls gleaming in the winter sun. The fleet was a floating empire. British dreadnoughts, French cruisers, and colonial auxiliaries flying flags from every corner of the world. The sailors called it Churchill's Armada. The plan was simple: bombard the Turkish forts guarding the strait, silence their guns, and clear a path for the minesweepers. But the Turks, led by a brilliant German officer named Otto Liman von Sanders and a rising Ottoman commander named Mustafa Kemal, were not the broken foe the Allies imagined. Their guns were well hidden, their gunners skilled. When the bombardment began, they answered with deadly accuracy. Minesweepers exploded in sheets of flame. One French battleship vanished in a column of smoke. Another sank within minutes. The sea was filled with oil, wreckage, and men struggling in the icy water. By mid-March, the naval assault had failed. The Allies had lost 3 battleships in a single day: the Bouvet, Irresistible, and Ocean, and several more were crippled. "We can no longer sweep the straits," one admiral admitted grimly. The Dardanelles were a death trap. Churchill refused to give up. If the ships could not pass, he argued, the army must. Land troops on Gallipoli, capture the forts from behind, and the straits would fall. It sounded simple on paper. On the maps in London, the peninsula looked small. A dagger-shaped strip of land only 50 miles long. Few realized that its ridges and ravines were almost impassable, its cliffs sheer, its defenders well dug in. In March, as snow fell over Flanders, soldiers across the empire received orders for a new eastern adventure. They were told little more than that they would be attacking the Turks somewhere by the sea. Among them were the men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the ANZAC, new troops who had never seen battle. They trained on the beaches of Egypt, running drills under the desert sun, laughing, writing letters home, dreaming of glory. "We'll be home by Christmas," they joked, echoing the optimism that had already died on the Western Front. Across the Mediterranean, the Ottomans prepared with equal determination. Mustafa Kemal, commanding the 19th Division, studied every cove and inlet of Gallipoli. "If they come," he told his officers, "they will come here." He pointed to a narrow crescent of beach beneath steep ridges north of Gaba Tepe, a place soon to be known to history as ANZAC Cove. April 1915 brought perfect weather for invasion. Clear skies, calm seas. On the evening of April 24th, an armada of troop ships assembled off the Aegean coast. The moon rose red over the water as thousands of soldiers waited in silence, listening to the creak of the ships and the low rumble of distant guns. Chaplains moved among them offering quiet prayers. Some men played cards to hide their fear. Others stared out at the black horizon, thinking of home. Shortly after midnight, the boats were lowered. Oars dipped into the water, muffled by cloth. The men were told to keep silent. Even whispers could carry across the still sea. The invasion had begun. To the south, British troops would land at Cape Hell, aiming to seize the tip of the peninsula and advance inland. To the north, the ANZACs would go ashore at dawn to secure the ridges. Between them, French forces would launch a diversion on the Asian shore. The plan was precise, timed to the minute. But war, as always, ignored the timetable. As the first grey light crept over the horizon, the Australians caught sight of the coastline ahead. It was not the gentle beach they had expected. Strong currents had swept their boats north during the night, toward a stretch of steep cliffs and tangled scrub. Officers squinted at their maps in disbelief. "This isn't the landing zone," one muttered, but it was too late. The boats ground onto the shingle, and the silence shattered. Turkish sentries opened fire from the heights. Bullets hissed across the water, slapping into the boats. Men leapt over the sides, wading through waist-deep surf as machine guns tore through the ranks. The sea turned red. Officers shouted, trying to form lines. But the beach was chaos. Men dragging the wounded, rifles jammed with sand, the air thick with smoke. A bugler tried to sound the advance, the notes breaking into static as he fell. One young Australian later wrote, "We had trained for months, but nothing could prepare us for that morning. The hills seemed alive with fire. We were just boys, and suddenly we were in hell." By mid-morning, small groups of survivors had fought their way up the slopes, clinging to gullies and rocks. They dug in where they could, using bayonets as shovels. On the ridgeline above them, Mustafa Kemal stood calm amid the chaos. When his retreating men told him they had no ammunition, he replied, "You have your bayonets and your bodies." Stop them. They did. The day that had begun with hope ended with the beaches of Gallipoli littered with the dead. The sea was choked with wreckage. The cries of the wounded echoed from the cliffs. But despite the slaughter, the Allies had gained a foothold. They believed reinforcements would soon turn disaster into victory. Few realized that they had already lost Gallipoli, not in ground, but in spirit. As darkness fell, flares arced over the ridges, casting ghostly light on the shattered shore. From the Turkish trenches came the faint call of a bugle, answered by another further inland. The battle paused for the night. the guns falling silent. Beneath the stars, thousands of men, British, French, Australian, and Turkish, waited for dawn, not knowing that this cursed peninsula would become their grave. The sun rose over Gallipoli like fire. Its light spread across the sea, glinting off the hulls of hundreds of Allied ships that dotted the horizon. For a moment, the water looked almost beautiful, calm, golden, serene, belying the horror that churned just beneath its surface. On the beaches below, the nightmare of the landings had begun. At Cape Helles, the southern tip of the peninsula, British troops of the 29th Division clambered down from their boats under withering fire. The plan had called for 5 separate landings along a narrow stretch of coast. In reality, only 2 would succeed in even reaching the shore. The sea was alive with machine gun fire, bullets slicing through the foam like rain. Boats overturned. Men leapt into the surf to escape the flames, their heavy packs dragging them down. The Lancashire Fusiliers landed on a beach that would forever after be known as W Beach. They were cut down before they could even reach the sand. The men who survived clawed their way ashore through barbed wire and bodies. One survivor recalled, "We went into the water with 700 men. When we reached the dunes, there were maybe 200 left." Later that day, 6 of the regiment's soldiers would be awarded the Victoria Cross, not for a single act, but because no one could decide who among them had shown the greatest courage. A few miles north, the French landed at Kumkale on the Asian shore as a diversion, fighting savagely before being ordered to withdraw. The beach was littered with their dead, the air thick with the smell of cordite and salt. Across the strait, the thunder of naval guns echoed through the morning as Allied warships tried to silence the Ottoman batteries that rained fire on the beaches. At ANZAC Cove, chaos ruled. The Australians and New Zealanders, young and eager, had been told the landing would be a surprise. It was not. The currents had carried them off course, dumping them under cliffs so steep that they seemed to rise straight out of the sea. The first wave hit the beach at dawn, stumbling from their boats into a wall of gunfire. Men fell in rows, their bodies rolling in the surf. Officers shouted for them to advance, but the terrain was impossible. Thorny scrub, sharp ridges, and ravines that swallowed entire platoons. Still, they pressed on. Small groups clawed their way up the slopes, fighting hand-to-hand against the Turkish defenders. The sound of battle was deafening, rifles cracking, machine guns stuttering, shouts and screams mingling with the thunder of artillery. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid, stinging the eyes. It was like climbing into the mouth of hell, one ANZAC soldier wrote later. By mid-morning, the Australians had reached the top of the first ridge, only to find themselves face-to-face with fresh waves of Ottoman troops, led by Mustafa Kemal himself. He had ridden to the front at full gallop, rallying his men with words that would become legend. "I am not ordering you to fight. I am ordering you to..." The Turks held the heights, firing down into the gullies where the ANZACs crouched. The ridges echoed with the cries of the wounded. The sea behind them was chaos. Boats drifting, supply crates sinking, signals lost. The narrow beach was jammed with the living and the dead. Doctors set up makeshift aid posts behind piles of sandbags. Stretcher bearers waded through the water, pulling men to safety. A chaplain moved from body to body, whispering prayers that were drowned by the roar of gunfire. Further south at V Beach, the British landing had turned into slaughter. The troops were packed inside the converted Collier River Clyde, a ship turned into a floating fortress. As its doors opened, the soldiers inside charged down gangways into a storm of bullets. They fell by the hundreds before they could reach the sand. The sea turned red around the hull. One officer described the scene. The men were brave beyond words, but it was hopeless. The beach was a charnel house. By the afternoon, the heat was suffocating. The wounded lay baking under the sun, crying for water. Flies gathered on the bodies. The air stank of blood and smoke. From the cliffs above, the Turks poured fire down on the beaches. For every foot the Allies advanced. They paid in lives. Yet somehow, against all logic, they clung to their footholds. By nightfall, the British at Hell and the ANZACs further north had dug shallow trenches, turning the beaches into fortresses of their own. That night, as the guns quieted, the cries of the wounded drifted across the water. Men called for help in English, in French, in Turkish. Some were answered. Most were not. Between the lines, where the dead lay thickest, the smell of death hung heavy. Rats scurried across the sand, feeding on the fallen. The sea, calm again after the day's fury, lapped gently at the shore, as if trying to wash away the blood. In London, news of the landings arrived shrouded in optimism. The headlines spoke of brilliant success in the Dardanelles, of our troops firmly ashore. The truth was far darker. Of the 70,000 men who landed on April 25th, more than 20,000 were killed or wounded within days. The beaches were secured, but at a price that would haunt generations. On the ground, the soldiers understood the truth before the generals did. "We have taken a strip of sand and lost a generation," one officer wrote in his diary. "If this is victory, God save us from defeat." The Turks, too, had suffered terribly. Their dead lay thick on the ridges, many of them young conscripts from distant Anatolian villages, but their resolve only hardened. The land was theirs. They would not give it up. Mustafa Kemal's leadership had turned the defense into legend. He walked among his men that night, sharing their rations and their exhaustion. "You will see," he told them quietly. "The sea will be full of enemy ships, but they will not leave this shore alive." On the beaches below, the exhausted Allies stared out at that same sea, now calm and moonlit. The warships, anchored offshore, looked like dark mountains against the horizon. Somewhere out there, Churchill and the admirals waited for news, still believing the campaign might yet succeed. But for the men on the ground, the dream of Gallipoli was already dying. They had seen what those cliffs could do to an army. As the night deepened, a few men began to sing softly, voices carrying over the water. Hymns, folk songs, fragments of tunes that reminded them of home. From the Turkish lines came an answering song, low and mournful. For a moment, the music of enemies mingled again, as it had once done at Christmas in France. Then the guns resumed, and the moment was gone. By June 1915, Gallipoli had become a furnace. The cold seas and chaos of April had given way to a summer of dust and decay. The trenches that once overlooked bright blue water were now pits of filth, carved into dry clay that baked under the relentless sun. Water was scarce, food scarce, and the stench of rot filled the air. The men who had landed with songs of empire and victory now lived like ghosts, hollow-eyed, their skin burned and blistered, their uniforms stiff with sweat and grime. The beaches that had been battlegrounds in April were now overcrowded camps. Tents stretched in rows along the narrow strips of sand, pressed between the sea and the cliffs. Every day, barges brought new troops, new supplies, new hope, and every night they carried away the wounded and the dead. The sea was their only link to the world beyond Gallipoli, but even that lifeline was fragile. Shells from Turkish guns rained down constantly, and the water was filled with the wrecks of boats and the bloated corpses of men who had died waiting for evacuation. Flies were everywhere. They covered the trenches, the food, the faces of the living and the dead alike. The smell of death and unwashed bodies clung to everything. Dysentery spread like wildfire, leaving men weak and feverish. The soldiers joked grimly that they were dying more from flies than bullets. "It's the filthiest place on earth," one wrote in his diary. "You can't eat without swallowing flies. You can't drink without tasting death." In the front-line trenches, the war had settled into the same pattern of misery that had already consumed France. The lines were only yards apart, so close that men could hear the enemy talking, coughing, even singing. The nights were filled with whispers, the days with gunfire and the whine of snipers' bullets. Every few yards of earth was soaked in blood. The same hills that had been painted red in April were now barren, stripped of grass and trees. The soil baked hard by the sun. The ANZACs held a small, precarious area around ANZAC Cove, hemmed in by ridges controlled by the Turks. Every attempt to advance ended in slaughter. "We charge up the hills. We come back down in halves," one soldier wrote bitterly. The Turks were dug in too deeply, their artillery hidden in the gullies above. Mustafa Kemal's troops fought with fanatical determination, driven by the belief that they were defending their homeland from invasion. Further south, at Cape Helle, the British and French faced the same nightmare. Their trenches inched forward and then backward, each attack costing hundreds of lives. The ground was rocky and dry, making it impossible to dig deep enough for protection. The heat made the air shimmer like glass. At night, jackals howled among the corpses that littered no man's land. Morale began to rot as quickly as the food in their tins. The men cursed the flies, the thirst, the generals, and the war itself. "We are dying by inches," one Australian wrote home, "not from fighting, but from waiting." Letters were their only comfort, scraps of paper carried over seas of death. Some still spoke of victory, others simply begged for news from home. On the cliffs above ANZAC Cove, the Turks lived no better. Their rations were smaller, their water scarcer, their casualties higher. But they had something the Allies did not: hope. For them, Gallipoli was sacred soil. Mustafa Kemal, now a national hero, moved among the lines constantly, encouraging his men, sharing their rations, promising that they would prevail. "We are not fighting for an empire," he told them. "We are fighting for our homes." The commanders on both sides searched desperately for a way to break the deadlock. In August, the Allies launched one last great offensive. New troops landed at Suvla Bay, a few miles north of the ANZAC lines. The plan was ambitious: break out from ANZAC Cove, seize the high ridges, and cut the Turkish army in two. For a moment, it seemed that surprise might favor them. The beaches were lightly defended, the Turks caught off guard. But confusion and hesitation ruined everything. The British troops, exhausted and parched, stopped to rest on the sand instead of pushing inland. By the time they advanced, the Turks had regrouped. The hills above Suvla became killing grounds. Men collapsed from thirst and heat before ever reaching the enemy. It was like fighting in an oven, one officer remembered. The gullies were filled with the wounded, crying for water. When night fell, the glow of burning scrub lit the hills like torches, revealing the dead scattered across the slopes. The offensive that was meant to save the campaign only deepened its misery. By the end of August, the Allies had gained nothing but graves. The front lines had barely moved. The high command in London and Paris still spoke of progress, but the men knew better. They had been left to die on a forgotten shore, while the world's attention turned back to the Western Front. The heat began to fade in September, replaced by storms that turned the trenches into rivers of mud. The rain washed through the shallow graves, uncovering the bones of men long dead. The sea that had burned blue in summer now boiled with thunder and lightning. Many wondered if God himself had turned against Gallipoli. Disease continued to ravage the ranks. Malaria, dysentery, and typhoid swept through the camps. Medical ships anchored offshore overflowed with the sick, their decks stained with blood and vomit. The doctors worked until their hands shook. Supplies ran low. Men grew gaunt and hollow, their eyes sunken. "We don't fight anymore," one British soldier wrote. "We just exist." Still, there were moments of humanity. On quiet nights, soldiers on both sides would stop firing and talk softly across the darkness. They traded cigarettes, swapped songs, and shouted jokes. In those brief pauses, the war seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the spirit of the Christmas truce had drifted across continents to this burning peninsula, reminding them that somewhere far away, the world still knew peace. But the guns always returned. Gallipoli had become a place where hope went to die. As autumn deepened, the men knew the campaign was lost. They could feel it in their bones, see it in the empty eyes of their officers. No amount of courage could change the terrain, the heat, or the disease. The soldiers of the Empire had come believing they would conquer the Dardanelles. Instead, they found themselves trapped on a strip of earth they could neither advance from nor abandon. The shorelines were full of graves, the hills full of ghosts. And still the orders came, "Hold fast." By November, Gallipoli was dying. The beaches that had once been alive with soldiers and shouts were now silent, but for the wind and the sea. The trenches were half empty, the camps shrinking by the day. The commanders had finally admitted what the soldiers had long known. The campaign was lost. All that remained was to escape without letting the enemy see. The order for evacuation came quietly. It was not announced with trumpets or dispatches, only whispered from man to man. "We're leaving." they said, in disbelief. For months they had fought, sweated, and bled for every inch of that cursed peninsula. Now they were to give it up without ceremony, as if the whole terrible struggle had been a bad dream. The withdrawal began in December, under cover of darkness. Every night, small groups of soldiers crept down to the beaches, carrying only what they could fit into their packs. The rest, the guns, the stores, the tents, would be left behind or destroyed. The men were ordered to move silently, to make no sign that anything had changed. Fires still burned in the trenches. Dummies were left on watch. Rifles were rigged to fire automatically when cans of water tipped over. The illusion of occupation had to hold until the very last boat was gone. To the south, at Cape Hell, the British held on longer, unwilling to admit defeat. The fighting there continued into the new year. Men froze in the trenches, their uniforms soaked by winter rain, their boots caked with ice. The storm that had been a rumor in summer now came with fury. Waves smashed the boats against the rocks. The wind tore through the camps. The sea that had once burned blue was now a gray beast devouring everything in its path. At last, in January 1916, the final troops were withdrawn. The beaches lay empty once more. The campaign that had begun with hope and trumpets ended with silence. Gallipoli belonged again to the Turks. But at a cost neither side could count. In 9 months of fighting, the Allies had suffered more than 250,000 casualties and killed, wounded, or missing. The Ottomans had lost roughly the same. The ground gained and lost measured only a few miles. Yet the cost was measured not in territory, but in lives and souls. When the survivors returned home, they carried the memory of Gallipoli like a scar. The British called it a tragedy, the French a folly. But for the men of Australia and New Zealand, it became something more, a birthmark. The ANZAC legend was born not from victory, but from endurance. The courage of those who had fought and died on that impossible shore became the foundation of national identity. Each year on April 25th, they would remember Gallipoli as the day their nations came of age, forged not by conquest, but by sacrifice. In Turkey, too, Gallipoli became sacred. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a rare victory in a war of losses. But for the Turkish people, it was the beginning of something greater. Mustafa Kemal's defense of the peninsula made him a hero. His name whispered with reverence. A decade later, he would lead a new revolution and become Atatürk, founder of modern Turkey. For him, Gallipoli was both the proving ground and the prophecy. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, he would later write to the families of the fallen, "You are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace." You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now our sons as well. The land itself seemed to remember. The trenches slowly filled with earth. The bones of soldiers, British, Australian, French, and Turkish, mingling beneath the same soil. Wildflowers grew over the graves. Farmers returned to till the fields, unearthing rusted rifles and shattered helmets with each plow. The sea washed clean the shores where so many had died. But even as the land healed, the ghosts of Gallipoli remained. In London, Churchill faced ruin. The campaign that had been his gamble ended his career for a time. He resigned from the Admiralty in disgrace. His vision of a bold victory turned to ashes. But years later, when he wrote his memoirs, he called Gallipoli the most daring conception of the war, a tragedy not of vision, but of execution. History would judge him harshly, but not without sympathy. The dream of breaking the deadlock had been noble, its failure catastrophic. For the soldiers, the dream had been simpler. They had wanted to survive. "We did our duty," one ANZAC veteran said years later. "That's all we could do. We went up those cliffs, we fought. We buried our mates, and we came home different men." He paused, then added quietly, "Gallipoli never leaves you. It stays in the blood." The campaign's legacy was not measured in victory or defeat, but in memory. For the British Empire, it marked the beginning of the end, the moment when faith in imperial invincibility began to crumble. For the Turks, it was the dawn of a nation. For the world, it was a lesson written in blood about the cost of arrogance and the courage of ordinary men. Each April, at dawn, they gather again, douching on the shores of ANZAC Cove. Thousands stand in silence as the sun rises over the sea, the same sun that rose over the landings in 1915. The waves lap softly against the rocks, and the gulls cry above the cliffs. Flowers are laid on the sand, where the first boats touched shore. In the quiet, a single bugle sounds the last post. The notes echo across the water, across the graves, across a century. They fade into the wind, and for a moment, the past feels close enough to touch. The voices of the men who never left, the whisper of the sea that once carried them here. Gallipoli was many things: a blunder, a bloodbath, a tragedy. But above all, it was a story of men who fought with courage amid futility, who found honor in survival, and whose memory turned defeat into legend. The empire that sent them is gone. The nations they became still remember. And when the dawn breaks over that quiet shore, it is said that if you listen closely, you can still hear the waves whisper their names. The names of those who fell on the dying shores of the empire.